Well, after this first session in the morning, I don't think I need to introduce myself too much. My formal affiliation is with the World Trade Institute. I manage the chairs program, and I keep on working with many of the chairs, which is a great pleasure. And I'm very glad to be here. Thank you, Dorothea, for this wonderful invitation. And we have a wonderful panel today. For me, this area is a relatively new area. So the topic that we are addressing in this panel on trade policy, free trade agreements, and feminist governance, the first thing I did is ask myself, what is feminist governance? So for that, I used ChatGPT, who tells me that feminist government generally refers to approaches to governing, whether in public institutions, organizations, or communities that are grounded in feminist principles such as equality, inclusivity, care, justice, and dismantling power imbalances. So I think that captures it.
That's very good.
Thank you very much. And then I went a step further. I tried to link it to the question, what is trade policy, free trade agreements, and feminist governance? But I looked it up because then you get a very long story. What it all includes and what it all refers to. It's quite interesting. So I'm very privileged to have this panel of eminent experts who know all about these questions, and we're going to approach them from different angles. So I think we'll start with a presentation online by Anna Venturatu, who is a lecturer at the University of Sheffield in international trade law. And she will address some of the questions from a WTO perspective and some of the obligations and some of the challenges that leads to, if I'm correct. So Anna, I gladly give the floor to you. So what I should say is I've asked the panelists to speak for about 6 to 7 minutes. So if you multiply that by 8, you come to about 1 hour. Then they have a chance to ask questions to each other. And then we open the floor for discussions. And then I think in 1.5 hours we'll be able to complete the program. So with that being said, Anna, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Many thanks to the organizers for the invitation, and also many thanks to Martin for chairing and for providing the definition for our panel. So I actually decided to skip an explanation of what I mean by feminist approach due to time constraints. So it is actually really good that you mentioned this already in your introduction. I would still want to kind of like add that from my perspective, feminism in this context is mostly a methodology, is the method that we are using in order to reevaluate established practices, particularly through a gender lens. I think that for most of us here in this conference already, we do have an understanding of the gendered impact of trade liberalization. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in explaining the various ways in which women are either prevented from enjoying the benefits of free trade, or the ways in which trade liberalization commitments themselves are actually affecting the degree to which women can enjoy other fundamental human rights. I think it is clear to everyone that there are several channels of interaction between gender and trade, and these affect women worldwide in different ways, in their different roles as entrepreneurs, as workers, as consumers, citizens, household managers, etc. And despite the lack of sex disaggregated data, it is clear from all the data that we have so far that this is indeed the truth of global trade. So what is my presentation about? My presentation is actually looking into the intersection of commitments that states have made in the area of gender equality and women's rights, and their trade liberalization commitments, specifically under the WTO. So now one would wonder, why are we still obsessing about the WTO? It is clearly not the best time to talk about WTO law and its interpretation. Although I'm not really one of the optimists that believe that the WTO will survive, at least in its current form, in future years, I do believe that the commitments that are made under the WTO will either be transformed or rather transferred into a different type of agreement, or as we are already seeing, a lot of these principles that are enshrined in the WTO agreements are actually being replicated in other agreements that are either regional or bilateral or simply preferential trade agreements. So unless we question actually the liberal assumptions underneath these rules, we are probably going to be facing similar rules, whether under the WTO or in other forms. So we do need to address possible tensions that are created between trade liberalization commitments and commitments regarding gender equality. It is clear that gender equality, human development, the enjoyment of human rights by all people is a shared commitment of the international community. It is reflected in several conventions already in the UN Charter. We have the ICCPR, the ICSCR, and of course we have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which provides for more specific obligations on gender equality. I would like to pay a little bit extra attention to particularly CEDAW, because in Article 3, it clearly states that states parties shall take in all fields, in particular political, social, economic, and cultural fields, all appropriate measures to ensure development, advancement of women, and the enjoyment of their human rights. So based on this provision, we know that trade is undoubtedly one of the fields where governments need to take action in accordance with CEDAW. There is absolutely no question about it, especially when we consider what I said before, all these multiple channels of interaction between trade and the enjoyment of women's rights. We also know that there is no fundamental tension between the World Trade regime or trade obligations more generally and the protection of human rights. So already in the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO, we see at the very beginning in the preamble a clear bridge between trade and human rights. They affirm that trade is just a means and not an end in itself, and that full enjoyment of human rights, raising standards of living, and global conditions is what we are looking for. However, when we are actually looking at the specific commitments the states have made under the WTO agreements, and particularly how they have been interpreted and applied so far in case law, there are clear tensions that arise when states, if states, not necessarily that they are doing it right now, but if states wanted to actually take all appropriate measures to ensure equality and to ensure full development of women's rights, we would see tensions arising. Some examples of places where tensions can arise are obviously the case of non-discrimination provisions, provisions regarding subsidies, GATS market access, liberalization commitments, and several other areas. So although we cannot apply international human rights law directly in the context of trade, we can reflect on what would be the role of treaty interpretation in that context. So could adopting an interpretative approach that is more deferential to international human rights law, particularly women's rights, be a corrective step, obviously not really fixing all the problems, but a corrective step towards that direction? I'm thinking of some simple examples. Could we interpret the terms like products, advantage, or less favorable treatment in the context of non-discrimination, or public morals, or human, animal, plant, life, or health in the context of exceptions through a feminist lens, through these provisions in international human rights law that provide for obligations in this respect? So what is my argument? And I'm not going to take too much more time. I know that I'm 6 minutes in. My argument is that, yes, as we already know, and that's not particularly novel, there is a presumption against conflict in international law. So we should be reading these two bodies of law together. I add to this reasoning that under Article 3, Paragraph 2 of the Dispute Settlement Understanding and Article 31, 3C of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, this is actually an obligation. Article 31, 3C says that we shall take into consideration other applicable rules of international law. What is the problem? The problem is that the approach so far has been, in the one panel report that has touched on this issue in EC Biotech, that in order to take into consideration these other rules of international law, they must be binding on all WTO member states, which of course creates a huge problem. It has been criticized several times, including in the fragmentation report of the International Law Commission. How are we going to do that? We have 166 members of the WTO. CEDAW has 189 member states, and there's still some discrepancy. Specifically, Tonga is not a party, and the United States has signed but not ratified the treaty. So unless we push back and we actually start thinking about a near universality rather than actually absolute universality, we would not be able to do that. And I think that this should be the right approach, not only for analytical reasons, because Article 31.3c does not really require that everyone is a member, but also for normative reasons, because this is a gender issue. If we don't do that, we will not be able to fully realize our commitments regarding gender equality and women's rights. I'm going to stop here, and hopefully we will have some time for a Q&A. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for your self-discipline in terms of time, but most importantly for these very interesting insights into the relation between discretion and WTO and international law. So we keep the questions for later. We move to the next presenters, I should say, who are Anushka Singh and Suryansh Pandey. They are final year learners pursuing law at the National Law University in Jabalpur, India. And so they will talk about evaluating the enforcement gap and gender responsive trade agreements provisions and designing effective compliance mechanisms. And they will more specifically look on the question how gender clauses lose enforceability in trade agreements and why enforcement gaps persist across treaty, institutional, and outcome levels. And then they will move on to gradual practical model that could make gender commitments enforceable. So let me pass on the floor to Anushka and to Siraj.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Before starting with the presentation, I hope I am clearly audible and visible to you all. Yes, okay. So as far as the introduction goes, I am Anushka Singh and my co-presenter Suryansh Pandey. We are a fifth-year law student from a national law university in India, and our paper title is Evaluating the Enforcement Gap in Gender Responsive Trade Agreements, Provisions, and Designing Effective Compliance Mechanisms. As well as the structure for the presentation goes, it is very well explained to you. I'll directly delve into the enforcement gap aspect of this presentation, and it is important to recognize the increasing gender responsiveness in trade agreements today. Drawing on the research of Professor Amrita Behri, one of our esteemed panelists who will present later, we see that gender-related clauses have become more visible and common in recent trade agreements. Professor's work highlights that more than 1/5 of FTAs now incorporate explicit gender provisions, often featured in dedicated chapters or cooperation mechanisms. However, as rightly noted by her, these provisions tend to be framed as aspirational commitments rather than enforceable rights, which brings us directly to the heart of the enforcement paradox. Now, I would like to explain what does enforcement paradox refers herein. It means the contradiction between the growing textual inclusion of gender clauses and their systematic exclusion from dispute settlement mechanisms. Despite the presence of gender provisions, they rarely attract the kind of enforcement that gives legal weight to traditional trade obligations. We can see several examples and several ways through which enforcement paradox can be explained herein. First is the explicit carve-out provisions. Many FTAs contain these explicit carve-out provisions, preventing any recourse to dispute settlement matters related to gender chapters. There are several examples like CPTPP, Chile, Uruguay, and Canada-Chile modernized FTA. The second One is the use of aspirational or best effort language that is commonly we can see in various FTAs. That is the shall endeavor clause or may consent to submit the disputes. One of the examples of the may consent to submit the disputes, which we can refer to as the mutual consent, is the Canada-Israel FTA, which subject gender provisions to dispute settlement only on consent basis, making jurisdiction binding but not compulsory. With this diagnosis of enforcement gap, we now pass to Suryansh, who will elaborate on the structural and institutional implementation of the same.
Thank you, Anushka. See, the gender enforcement gap could be analyzed at three levels. First is the treaty level. As already emphasized by Anushka, that there is increasing trend of gender responsiveness in the FTAs, but they are systematically excluded from the dispute settlement mechanisms, thereby reducing their enforceability through these FTAs, and thereby reducing their impact, the actual impact of the free trade agreements. Now, at the output level, that is at the institutional level, we can see that a gender responsiveness would be infructuous if the countries fail to raise their structural dexterity and infrastructural readiness. At the third level, analysis could be done at the outcome level. So even if the institutions are well adapted to actually implement what is written in the FTAs, sometimes we do not see the actual result coming up at the outcome level. So is the inclusion of gender responsive provisions followed by apt infrastructural readiness of the country actually converting into expected outcome? So unless the countries are not excelling at the third level of analysis, a good performance at the other two levels would not matter much. See, at the treaty level analysis, Anushka has already emphasized on how these there is soft law language used, and such as best endeavor clauses, they lack justiciability. At the institutional level, there is sort of administrative siloing, lack of coordination. One example I would give of India, so wherein even if we want to implement good regulatory practices related to various aspects of the free trade agreements, there is always a chance of complex to and fro from various ministries, and it presents a regulatory complexity. This mainly happens in developing countries and least developing countries, where the regulatory development is not so much coordinated. There is also a systematic deprioritization of gender compliance, because the countries, though they do want to work on gender responsiveness, but that topic itself lies at the at very end of their priority. There is also lack of gender expertise in trade bodies. There is data infrastructure deficiency. There is weak domestic legal linkages, such that whatever is written at the treaty level is not able to actually being adopted at the institutional level or at the outcome level. Third level is outcome level, where is there might be diffusion of impacts. So there is in the developing countries as well as least developed countries, there is already a regulatory complexity that is not adept, or that is not proper for the gender for implementing the gender responsiveness responsive trade agreements. And sometimes the countries fail to bring or are not able to bring reforms in their existing domestic legislation or regulatory regime. That makes it more difficult to bring out the reforms that they actually want. So with that, I would, Anushka, to suggestions.
So now I will
Thank
move
you.
with our suggestions with regards to the movement from the soft law practice to hard law obligations. We have stipulated 5 suggestions. There are many more, but the majority of suggestions are: the first one is the inclusion of the standalone chapters with targeted compliance. The second one is the increasing access. Second is the increasing access to international market. That will be the capacity building. That will be building of capacity funds for technical assistance for gender. The third
Can
one.
I briefly,
in-
keep an eye on the times? I'm Swiss, so I follow Swiss minutes. So just please try to keep it short. I'm sorry to interrupt your presentation.
We'll just wrap
Thank
it up.
you.
1 minute. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. As far as the suggestion goes, I'll wrap it up in the course of next 30 seconds only. I'll not take much of the time. The third suggestion is the increasing of the representation of women at the institutional level. The fourth one is enforcing penalties for egregious violations. And the last suggestion is building robust institutional infrastructure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And my apologies for having interrupted your presentation. So from India, we now move to Canada. No? Yes, we do. With Laura MacDonald and Beth Warren-Nuke from Laura is professor at Carleton University and Beth at the University of Toronto. No,
I'll explain.
Oh. So I'm wrongly informed on that. But anyway, we'll get a couple of examples, I believe, on what is happening in the world in a couple of countries. Some case studies, I guess, on feminist foreign policies. But I'll let you introduce perhaps better than I can yourself and your colleague and what you're going to say.
ChatGPT was okay on feminist.
No, Nora.
Hi, thank you very much. I really want to thank the organizers for this wonderful conference. It's been a wonderful opportunity to be here and see the wonderful country of Chile, where I've never been before. So yes, this paper is co-authored with my longtime friend, Beth Warren-Nuke, who is not at U of T. She's public intellectual, I would say. She's now working for something called the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative. And this is a leading institution that's pushing forward the agenda of feminist foreign policy. We worked together in a civil society group that was working with the Canadian government around consultations around developing a document for a Canadian feminist foreign policy. I would say a failed effort, as the document never came out. But I was invited to participate in this civil society group because of my relative expertise on trade. And that's part of the story of this presentation, that there's a lack of expertise in the area of feminist foreign policy around trade policy and vice versa. I was happy to hear, though, that Marcela Otero made a reference to Chilean feminist foreign policy as kind of overarching framework for trade policy in her presentation, which shows Chile's leadership in this general area. So I will try to move quickly. What do I do? Oh, sorry. I got it. Yeah. So what is feminist foreign policy? I put up a quote here. You might not be able to see it. This is an early kind of formulation because this is a pretty recent area of policy development. But I highlighted some terms that are, and this comes from a Global North institution. So the terms I've highlighted in this statement are about peace, gender equality, environmental integrity, human rights. And those are terms which are good, but you don't see any reference to trade here or economic empowerment. But my question is this changing over time as feminist foreign policy evolves? Speaking of which, we have a graphic here that shows the countries signing on to feminist foreign policies, beginning with global north countries, but then increasingly moving into the global south, especially Latin America. We do see some backward movement, like with Sweden, which was the pioneer, which no longer has one. Canada I could talk more about, but our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister seem to disagree about whether we now have a feminist foreign policy at all. As of last week. Yes. So we'll see what's happening with that. But overall, we do see a upward movement of the number of countries committing to this. So in the paper, which is a work in progress, oh damn, they don't fit on here, but the question is there an overlap between states' feminist foreign policies and gender and trade policies and what we're doing? And this, again, work in progress. I appreciate any suggestions, as we chose 7 states to focus on, which do have some level of commitment to a feminist foreign policy. Canada, iffy, as I just said, in Australia, wouldn't use that term, but still has an international gender equality strategy, which to me is pretty similar. And we're using government documents and civil society documents. So our argument, to state it up front, in case my 6 minutes runs out, that trade policy is a neglected area when governments and civil societies are formulating their feminist foreign policies. There's no clear correlation between having an FFP and having gender-sensitive trade policies. And I would argue that trade policies lack some of the transformative perspective of some feminist foreign policies, particularly the rights perspective that Anna was talking about. So I'm not going to go into these at all, just flashing this up here to show you what we're doing in terms of method. We're just right now working on this table in which we say, is there a feminist foreign policy commitment and of what type, and is there any trade element for these 7 countries? And then over here, just listing some of the not feminist, economic equality, what do we call it? Gender and trade, gender sensitive trade policies. So just flashing it up here to make Martin happy. So
elaborate on one of the examples.
Yeah, I mean, at Chile, we have a lot here, and I think it's a star on both sides of the equation. However, this may be at risk, and feminist foreign policy is highly politicized in some cases, perhaps in a way that gender and trade policy aren't always politicized publicly. So we'll see what happens, but we have this upcoming election, which is a little scary. Colombia has a feminist foreign policy, but doesn't really talk about gender, et cetera, et cetera. If there are questions, I can go into more. But to illustrate my point, I really just pulled upon a couple of statements from both fields. The first is from a very recent meeting, the 4th Ministerial Conference on Feminist Foreign Policy. There were 31 signatories, including Canada, even though that happened last month, signing on to the idea of feminist foreign policy. And again, you see here this language around democratic principles, universality of human rights, again, speaking to Anna's point, feminist, talking about peace, SDGs are referred to, and so forth. Another point I wanted to mention is that in this grouping, their policy is that if a global north country wants to join, they have to have a twin global south country enter in at the same time. So this is to avoid global north dominance of the field, which was kind of the tendency at the beginning. So a particular, but there's nothing here on trade or resourcing even. How are we going to finance all this? And then I don't have to go over this. You all know this by heart, probably, the Buenos Aires Declaration, a very different kind of discourse. So this is kind of a discursive analysis of the types of concepts and normative frameworks that are used in each. Oops, sorry, move it forward. So it's women, not feminist, not gender, much more technocratic approach, and the term is economic empowerment rather than empowerment in general or equality. So it's a different kind of discourse. Of course, this is a much older declaration. So that just illustrates what we're trying to do. So basically our argument that there's a siloing taking place in the field of feminist governance that Martin was referring to, between trade on the one hand and other aspects of feminist foreign policy on the other, which are more about women, peace and security, human rights, sexual and reproductive rights, and so forth. And my argument is that this reflects the distinct historical, institutional, and ideological or discursive roots of the two policy areas. For example, trade policy is usually housed in the trade ministry. So in Mexico, for example, it's the foreign ministry that's adopted the feminist foreign policy, and the trade ministry, which is a separate ministry, has nothing to do with it. As far as I know, I have to do more research on that. And civil society itself is also bifurcated. So on the FFP side, you have like peace building organizations, sexual and reproductive rights, human rights organizations, and feminist organizations. And on the trade side, it's more tends to be, and I do participate in such a body in Canada, an advisory group, and it's almost all women-owned businesses organizations. So there's this bifurcation, and they don't tend to speak to each other. So we're arguing that, you know, it's not that one's good and one's bad, but we could be using feminist foreign policy to promote and refine the gender and trade work, to bring in some of these other values that are often overlooked around human rights, the SDGs, peace, etc. And you can't see it here, sorry, but I do argue that we may be seeing some examples of convergence. So some of the Latin American feminist foreign policies are referring to the care economy, which I think is a very important bridging concept to bring together these two discursive fields. And we see there very much the influence of CEPAL or the ECLAC on the development of that discourse and the promotion of it across countries. And I argue, as I just did earlier, that we could also see the strengthening of gender provisions in labor chapters as an important way of achieving this. And finally, I'm looking in more detail at the EU-Chile FTA, which I think uses different kinds of language because of the European influence and different methods, so there might be an interesting shift here happening that could be instructive for other gender and trade policies as well as feminist foreign policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for a very interesting research that you're conducting, paper that you're preparing, and I'm sure there will be questions. I hope you will keep your questions for later so that we can have a discussion on these points. So let's again cross the Atlantic and go to the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I get it right this time. Ina Opatiova, the University of Groningen. Yes, correct. Okay, my home country, where we, so I just said I'm Swiss and I say I'm Dutch, I'm both. So that is the advantage of being a European several. Anyway, so we look at the European aspect and legislation on some of these gender considerations and aspects. So, Ina, without taking more of your time, please go ahead.
All right. I hope everything is working. If something is not working, then please shout. So yeah, today I'm gonna be talking about EU trade agreements and how it is including gender within these trade agreements. I'm gonna talk about 4 main clauses, which I found as I was systematically analyzing all current trade agreements that the EU has with third countries. And I'm going to be especially looking into their gender responsiveness. And here I would just clarify. So when I'm talking about gender responsive, I mean, to what extent does the agreement actually refer to certain root causes of inequalities rather than being just gender sensitive, which I understand as only accommodating for a differential situation of women, which is, however, caused by these structural factors. So first, I would start with the first type of clause, and then I will move on to the rest. So firstly, EU has a lot of these cooperation and political dialogue clauses, which are very broad, kind of vague, and usually mostly aspirational, so very, very broad. So they can either concern political dialogue between the parties on the topic of gender equality, or they specifically pay attention to certain areas, such as you can see in the example in the presentation, to women in production process. Then there are clauses which concern commitment to multilateral labor standards, and then they usually concern women as workers, and they offer protection of women in employment and refer to different instruments, usually from the International Labor Organization, that protect decent work and employment rights. And then thirdly, there are provisions which mainstream gender directly within the main provisions of the trade agreement. And these concern very specific areas. So for instance, here you can see there is protection of investors. There are, for instance, also including women within the agriculture or fisheries. And these concern they sort of try to address the differential impact of trade on women in certain areas due to their different situation, and they try to correct that. But they still remain somewhat gender sensitive, as they still only try to correct that situation rather than addressing the root causes of that situation and of that gender inequality. And then lastly, there are trade and gender equality provisions and chapters. And I know that some people from this panel will be talking about them a bit more. So just in general, there are currently, I believe, 4 agreements, which include either a trade and gender equality provision or a chapter. And they mostly mention certain commitments of the parties, usually to the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, so gender equality, but also commitment to Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and the sede, which was already mentioned here as well. So they strengthen the parties' obligations in these areas. And they also mention different ways of achieving the objective of these mechanisms, which is, for instance, preventing violence against women, promoting equal access to services and resources, promoting equal opportunities for women in the economy in general. And these chapters can also work as sort of guiding principles for interpretation of the agreement as a whole. So other provisions can be seen through the lens of the gender equality provisions and chapters, which is nice. But on the other hand, for instance, as you can also see in the provision in the PowerPoint, women are seen in these many times as just kind of an instrument to achieve economic activity and growth, and do not really look into women as their own people who have interest in gender equality, aside from just contributing to the growth of the country overall. And they also focus a bit more on the particular areas within which women are somehow disadvantaged more, rather than focusing really on the core issues of women's disadvantage, such as the gender biases, gender stereotypes, and all of these structural issues. So to kind of summarize and offer you my critical reflection of all the agreements, first of all, what I saw as a big issue with multiple agreements, especially the first 2 types of provisions that I mentioned, is the fact that they still view women as a homogeneous category. And what I mean are 2 things. So first, they still see women as only within a particular sector. So for instance, the second provision, the second type of provision which I mentioned, only see women as workers, but they do not see their roles in particular sectors, such as agriculture, such as sector of small and medium-sized enterprises, which all of come with their own issues for women. And also they most of the time ignore women's role in reproductive sector, which is also affected by trade liberalization. There's also a lack of intersectionality in their understanding of women, and the fact that women have multiple identities would intersect with each other and create unique situations for those types of women, such as socioeconomic status, ethnicity, sexual orientation. So all of these things are kind of separated within the agreements. There's also a lack of enforcement and monitoring, as was already mentioned in the previous presentation as well. I would also like to talk a bit about the issue of coloniality of many of these, especially gender and trade provisions and chapters, because usually they can be found in the agreements with the countries from the global south. But for instance, with the agreement with Canada, there is very little mention of women, for instance. And also not addressing the root causes of gender inequality, which I have already covered before. So that would be it from me.
Thank you very much for highlighting the provisions that on the one hand exist that are integrated into those agreements and the shortcomings and the applicability of those. And I'm sure there will be questions as a result of your presentation. So I believe, unless I'm mistaken, we stay in the Netherlands. We go a little bit from Groningen, we go a little bit south to Utrecht. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, it's LinkedIn, it's not ChatGPT. So we have Marjolein Quist and we have Dr. Patricia Minos to talk about the reality check, an assessment of the effectiveness of gender chapter of the EU-Chile trade agreement. And I'm glad we are still in the Netherlands because going back to Laura's presentation where I saw on the graph that the FSP is particularly well integrated in Dutch foreign policy. So I noted that, so I was very happy to see that. It was at the extreme right of the top. I'm very happy to see that. So without much ado,
Until recently.
Until recently. Okay, let me give the floor. And please introduce yourself if I said anything that is incorrect.
Thank you so much. I'm Marjolein Quist, and this is my colleague, Dr. Patricia Munoz Cambrera, and we've been doing this research together with another colleague who's unfortunately not in the presentation, Evalia Colombo. We'll quickly, explain why we've been doing our research. We'll look into the reality of Chilean women. We'll dive into the Chilean trade agreement between Chile and the European Union and see where we can make connections and where perhaps there are none. And we'll share some of our initial findings. First, I want to quickly explain a little bit because Patricia is an academic expert. I work for an NGO. It's called Women Equals Men Dutch Gender Platform. It's a network of over 50 organizations and individual experts who are advocating for gender equality and women's rights globally. And we focus on building connections and collaboration and building and sharing knowledge. And I do so specifically for the Gender and Sustainable Economy program, where we focus on international trade and investment, corporate accountability, but also the link between gender and climate and biodiversity. And we specifically work together closely with the Dutch government. We've also worked a lot on the feminist foreign policy, to some extent also with the European Union. So we aim to bring all the expertise from our member organizations to inform politics and policies. I think it's good to give a little bit of background about that. And then to our research, we aim to do a reality check of the gender chapter in the EU-Chile trade agreement. And I know I'm not saying anything new to this audience, but trade agreements are not gender neutral. And I think we see that they impact women and men differently, and that is due to structural inequalities. And that's about the fulfillment of rights, but also about access to resources, livelihood, empowerment, both politically and economically. But also, very importantly, it's about agency and voice. Who gets to decide and who's on the table, who's at the table when decisions are being made. Why we focused on this agreement, first of all, is because it's the significance of, for the EU, this was the first agreement that had a gender chapter, a dedicated gender chapter. And the question we were most interested in is, what is the impact of what's written on paper in an agreement on the ground, and how does the reality of gender inequality in Chile and the reality of Chilean women in all their diversity, how does that connect to what's written in the agreements, to the commitments and the provisions that are in there? And to do so, we aim to do a holistic and intersectional analysis, and where we very much look at women in all their diversity, specifically so women, indigenous women, rural women, women SMEs, with the aim to provide more evidence-based recommendations, both for the implementation of this agreement, but also for further trade negotiations on behalf of the EU and its member states.
Yes, thank you very much, Marjolaine. I will quickly go through more or less kind of the content of what we have been able to do so far. The work is ongoing, and I just came back from my home country, Chile, although I am based in New Delhi, in India, but I'm also Dutch and Belgian, so it's a complicated story. To put it very clearly, we start from the micro level in our research, trying to dig into the material realities of grassroots women. And we have taken two social categories of women in Chile, which is indigenous and rural women. So we went there, we have interviewed 5 prominent leaders of these women's associations, and this is the raw empirical data that we want to share with you today. So this is how their experiences in their daily lives, in their efforts to sustainable livelihoods, the expansion of trade agreements, and in particular, the possibility or the likely impact scenario of increased investment and trade on agriculture and critical minerals, lithium and copper being a case in point. So these are the testimonies. Now we move on to the next PowerPoint, where we make a historical line of where we come from until the signature of the Advanced Framework Agreement, and in particular, the trade part of this agreement, which entered into force this year. The larger advanced agreement, also known as AFA, is waiting for ratification from all 27 European member states. In Chile, it was ratified by Congress, so the current status is that we are waiting for ratification from the European Union member states side. Now, we need to also point out that Chile, the next slide please, is a pioneer in proposing gender provisions and gender chapters more lately. So there have been clear efforts to incorporate in practice gender equality commitments in trade agreements and also at the domestic institutional fabric, and it applies to the legal and the policy frameworks that Chile has today. In few years, Chile has built a robust policy and normative framework. So there are the instruments. And as we conclude at the end, the probably one of the shortcomings is at the level of enforcement and implementation, as was argued today. The next slide, please. This is a kind of a sample of some of the chapters of the trade agreement, the advanced trade agreement, and likely impacts on the ground. I will focus on 2 because of the shortness of time. The first one is that there has been a reduction of import tariffs, around 99% for both sides. This, as macroeconomists, feminist macroeconomists have argued, has resulted in other contexts on a fiscal squeeze. What do we mean by that? That the capacity of the government to collect revenues for social investment will be reduced. So there is a likely impact scenario that will hit more marginalized women the hardest, like indigenous, for example, and rural women in Chile. The second important element we want to introduce into the debate is access for large EU companies to government procurement. The reality of women entrepreneurs in Chile shows that they are competing on unequal terms with large companies for socio-cultural factors like care burden, for example, lack of an integrated care system, but also because of less credibility on the potential of women entrepreneurs and women traders and producers to really export. So these are two important elements. And the third one I want to focus on in this short time frame is increased access to raw materials and critical minerals, which are crucial for the European Union transition and decarbonization. And this shows that there is a big disconnect between gender equality in gender provisions and environmental sustainability, because biodiversity areas will be opened, ecosystems will be made more vulnerable, and we women on the ground fear a likely increase in sacrifice zones. That means devastated ecosystem, uncertainty in sustainable livelihoods, and impacts on women's health and reproductive rights, to mention but a few. The last slide, please. You, Martin, stop me, please, if I move forward. These are some sections of the gender chapter. Sorry?
If you can wrap up, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Please let us have a look at this. We picked up some articles for you, and you see what is mentioned, the kind of the strong dimensions on the left, and probably a few shortcomings on the right. To be in line of what someone said before, there is lack of coordination across different policies, because Chile indeed has a robust set of policies and normative frameworks, but it depends on which ministry you talk to, and it depends on which policy document you read. And the last point is the next one and last one, the preliminary findings. We praise the landmark efforts on gender mainstreaming in trade agreements, also the robust set of policy, but the shortcomings are as follows. It's more a compilation of good intentions and existing gender commitments. Primary focus is on gender, overlooking intersecting inequalities affecting women on the ground, a disconnect between the policy and the practice level, as we have shown. Sustainability and human rights in business practices are poorly incorporated, and we know that voluntary guidelines are not enough. Enforcement and binding mechanisms are needed. A mixed approach is needed. Why a separate chapter only? Why not embedding gender equality, intersectional issues all over the place, everywhere, and more space for meaningful engagement and collaboration with women's organizations and civil society as a whole, as Marcela Otero yesterday rightly pointed out. Thank you very much, Marie-Jolaine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think your presentation points again to the fact that you can make regulations, rules, but to put them in practice, there are shortcomings, there are challenges to face. So let's move to the next speaker, who's sitting next to me, and I'm very glad. I think she doesn't need more introduction because she has been speaking before, and she will focus on some of the Indian policies in putting these gender policies into place, and what is the experience, where does India stand on this? So please, Nia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Greetings, everyone. So today I'll be presenting regarding India's evolving approach to the integration of gender consideration in free trade agreements specifically. drawing on comparative treaty practice and also a bit of comparison with the domestic policies and case. So I have analyzed mainly EFTA and UK FTAs that are very recent and the implication for India's future treaty making model as well. So at the risk of repeating a lot of things said over the span of 2 days, I'll still just give a bit of a global context. We see that over the past decade, gender has shifted from a peripheral concern to a very structured component of the modern trade governance. We also see a proliferation of standalone gender chapters instead of few provisions cross-cutting across different chapters in an FTAs. And a lot of cooperation-based instruments in FTAs are also seen across Latin America, Europe, and the Asia Pacific. Much of this transformation has been supported by WTO's informal working group on trade and gender, as well as analytical frameworks developed by UNCTAD, OECD, and UN Women. These developments have created an informal normative expectations for states negotiating new generation FTAs. So looking at India's trajectory, historically, India has been quite opposed to including social and gender concerns in trade agreements, grounded partly as a defense of regulatory autonomy and partly in the developmental skepticism towards conditionality. However, this stance has gradually shifted. India's recent FTAs, particularly the India-EFTA, TEPA, and the India-UK FTA, like I mentioned at the beginning, represent first instances where India has accepted specific gender-responsive provisions, mainly in the India-UK FTA, where they have an entire chapter dedicated to trade and women, or gender. Importantly, these provisions remain, however, non-binding, cooperation-oriented, and explicitly insulated from dispute settlement. As this has been repeated a lot of time by multiple speakers, how it is all an endeavor-based language or best, no, I correct myself, good practices language, and more so a soft law binding. So, as we can see, India continues to resist enforceable gender or even labor commitments, cross-chapter gender mainstreaming or obligations referencing ILO instruments. Like specific, they do reference ILO instruments, but not as a binding commitment. This sort of selective alignment reflects both external pressures as such from advanced economies that have institutionalized gender-responsive trade and internal policy evolution, including the foreign trade policy of 2023, which emphasizes on women-led MSMEs, digital inclusion, and export competitiveness. Now, if I compare this FTA provisions with India's domestic and multilateral frameworks, we will see that India's FTA practice converges with multilateral norms, given the emphasis on cooperation, knowledge exchange, entrepreneurship support, and voluntary data collaboration. However, India's FTAs diverge from emerging multilateral expectations on issues such as gender impact assessment, structured monitoring, and cross-cutting integration across digital trade, labor mobility, and procurement. Domestically, though, India is quite advanced in supporting women, especially given our constitution, which specifically in Articles 14, 15, 16 are dedicated towards women's rights. And there are more provisions as well. And then we have comprehensive MSME and digital skill-related programs that strongly support women's economic participation. But current FTAs do not yet reflect the full breadth of these domestic commitments. In particular, India tends to avoid obligations related to labor standards or mandatory data systems, areas that may eventually become focal points in negotiation with partners like the EU, Australia, or Canada. Now, India's position, as we can see, as we have seen while analyzing different treaty practices and other engagement in the multilateral fora, that it is shaped generally by the concerns over asymmetric regulatory burdens, the risk of important conditionality, and the practical challenge of coordinating multiple ministries with differing mandates. We do not have a dedicated trade and gender ministry, as even Laura pointed out, that we have different forums and different areas that work on different, like the ministry is not related to trade, it's outside, it's under the foreign policy ministry. So it's the same everywhere, I guess. So India's FTA commitment therefore remain deliberately cautious in a way. Like cooperation, sure, we'll go ahead with that, but enforceability, not yet, no. Institutional dialogue, yes. Prescriptive obligations, no, thank you. So, as a suggestion that we are putting forward a sort of a model gender chapter, if we can say there's a model gender chapter for India, it has to strike a balance between ambition and feasibility. So key features of it could be a development-oriented scope, which centers on MSME competitiveness, digital inclusion, entrepreneurship, and values in participation for women, especially. Structured institutional architecture, maybe a joint committee on trade and gender, national contact points specifically facilitating all these activities, cooperation agenda encompassing skills, finance, digital literacy, export readiness, and data methodologies, selective cross-chapter linkages, very selective, again, being cautious, especially with SMEs, digital trade, and services, while still avoiding the broad conditionality frameworks. Also, an implementation roadmap we are sort of suggesting, it's still a work in progress, but something that strengthens the interministerial coordination, enhances gender disaggregated trade data collection, and deploys pilot projects in key export sectors. So in essence, if I had to, I'm going to conclude. So India is sort of crafting a gender model that could be helpful for the entire global South, as India has emerged and is sort of seen as a leader in, not a leader, more as a spokesperson for the entirety of global South. We have seen that in BRICS, we have seen that in G20 meetings as well. So I guess such a model has to be gender responsive in a way that it is principled yet pragmatic, cooperative yet sovereignty conscious. So the challenge ahead is to ensure that these soft commitments do translate into tangible improvements in women's economic agency and trade participation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to that.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. And again, I repeat, please keep your questions for later so we can have all the presentations final, and I'm sure there will be questions. So last but not least, or not last, there's another presentation after the one picked up, but I'm not sure if that person is online. No, it's not. Okay, so this will be the last presentation by my dear friend, Amrita. She doesn't need any introduction. We all know her. Certainly, if you didn't know her, you know her by now. So Amrita, please, the floor is yours, and I'm sure you will give us some nice insights about the gender equality in trade agreements and what is called the illusion of inclusion by imitation. And if you introduce the topic yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So I think we've sort of discussed quite a bit how, a couple of trade agreements now include these good-looking provisions on gender, on women. A couple of years ago, there were a few studies that showed 25% trade agreements talk explicitly so about gender provisions. So the trade and gender scholars like us, we became very happy, quite excited. Wow, 25%. And then the next step was, to go and take a deeper look into what these provisions look like. So a couple of us started to read the way these provisions are drafted, their scope, their location, their nature, as to how they're included in trade agreements. And it is. It's all right. And so we realized that the more we were reading these provisions in trade agreements, we were falling in this trap of repetition. I mean, it all seemed very repetitive. Like you were reading, so we started reading a new trade agreement, and we were like, I've just read it. I just read the exact same language, the exact same provision, the exact same commitment. So what was essentially happening is, and now I'm working on this paper, which I'm including in the next few weeks, where I have shown with evidence, with quantitative evidence, that majority, but a heavy majority, more than 62% of provisions related to gender or women in trade agreements are a complete copy and paste. Complete copy and paste from the previous templates of trade agreements. Finding number one. Finding number two, where have these templates been designed? Mostly in developed countries. Chile is an exception. However, Chile also has come up with its own template. If you look at Ecuador, Chile, the trade and gender chapter, and then you read Chile, Argentina, and then you read the chapter in Chile, Brazil, they are the same, exactly the same. So Chile has also come up with its boilerplate language. So going back to my second finding, right? Most of these templates, with very few exceptions, have been designed by and for the developed world, the global north. Now, let me present to you some evidence. Antonia, can you share the? So, right. So here you can just see if I've copied and pasted here the tables from my make it smaller. Yeah. I think that bit bigger. Yeah. Yeah, that should work, no? So you may not be able to read it, but just, it's a table that I incorporate in my article, upcoming article, where you can see the provisions in the first column, the trade agreements with the precise articles where these provisions have been copied. And you can see how predominantly these provisions are copied by UK, EU, Canada, and sometimes by the US. And the number of FTAs where these provisions have been repeated verbatim. And we scroll down, Antonietta, 25, 17, 16. These are different provisions, 12. So I've just given you 5 samples, really 5 quick examples with the respective, we can take it off, with the respective trade agreements, with the respective articles, and they have been repeated verbatim, word by word. Now, what's the benefit of doing it? Of course, we have the familiarity factor. Trade negotiators, when they have already added a provision before, they feel familiar and more comfortable. They are operating in their safe zone. If they are incorporating the same language, the compliance cost is lower for countries who are incorporating the same provision that they've already ratified in a previous agreement. It is easier for them to negotiate. It's a low-hanging fruit because they've already negotiated that in a different setting with a different trade agreement. So the benefits are, and the cost of negotiation and the bargaining is lower, right? Because time-wise, it's more efficient. So the cost of negotiation for developing countries is lower as well. But there are serious problems that this plagiarism or this boilerplate, extensive use of boilerplate language is causing. And one of that serious problems is a huge disconnect between the challenges that especially the women in developing countries are facing and the policy solutions that these trade agreements are providing, because these provisions are being designed by developed countries in pretty much complete sort of ignorance of the challenges and problems that women face in developing countries. So this disconnect can probably be justified for a number of reasons. One is technology. So we have this fast track, we have Google Drive, you can share, you can all work at it at the same time, copy and paste, and it just makes life easier. And second, and I'll conclude with that, second is the diffusion theory. Perhaps one way of understanding what's happening and this extensive, and this trade and gender provisions are not the only ones. All the other social provisions are facing the same dilemma. They are being copied and pasted extensively. Right? So diffusion theory, if you look at when the CEDAW Convention and the UN Human Rights Declaration was signed, it was at the time when developing countries were clearly not ready. They are even not ready today to sign up to the kind of commitments that they signed up to back then 50 years ago. But they were the first ones who raised for it and who signed these conventions and declarations and the UN Charter because probably that was a good thing to do because the developed countries had designed those templates for that, right? So you can probably blame it on the diffusion theory, the global diffusion theory. But I wanted to just sort of present this problem out there to these experts and see if you have any reflections about whether this is a problem or whether it is something which is acceptable and we should let it go on.
Rita, for these interesting points. You reminded me of the following. Before coming here, I did a little bit of homework. And as this topic is about the issue that we are discussing now, trade policy, free trade agreements, and feminist governance, I tried to find out from the WTO what are the gender issues included in the FTAs in the WTO. And perhaps some of you have done that, but if not, I encourage you to go on the database of the WTO. You have an excellent database, and you can search actually on the FTAs that have been adopted or submitted or notified to the WTO with gender provisions. And you reminded me of that because perhaps one way of comparing the content of the FTAs on those issues where there's repetition, maybe that explains part of the application, because once you have these FTAs integrate gender provisions, there's a tendency to replicate the language. No more about that. Time for questions to each other if you have, and then ask questions. We have about 15, 20 minutes, I'm told. So then we will try to wrap up. So any comments, any questions on each other's presentations?
I just
or from the colleagues online, don't hesitate to raise your hand.
I see Jane has.
Okay, yeah, Jane, you have a hand. So let me start with Jane.
Shall I go first? Thank you so much. Thank you for these. That's a super rich discussion. I have so many questions. I'll try and narrow it down. All my questions, just translate the frustration at not being there to be able to discuss this in person. So if I can just, whoever wants to respond. So we've talked a lot about what kind of provisions, should be included in trade agreements. They don't go far enough, etc. And Rita just talked about this kind of boilerplate types of provisions that we find, not only in the gender area, but in a lot of areas. And I wanted to suggest one thing, which is, after all, trade agreements are in place, at the outset for reasons of market access. And so, should one of our main suggestions within trade agreements not be to do ex ante gender impact analyses to better understand how women are going to be affected by these market access commitments? Are the market access commitments taken in areas where women work and lead businesses and will be looking to export? And how can they be supported? Another question that I had was, and this is something I've been trying to get my head around for a long time, so I'd really be interested in any ideas from the panel. And that is, on these areas where trade agreements overlap with gender equality treaties and conventions like CEDAW, like ILO conventions on non-discrimination. So how can the implementation of trade agreements support these other treaties and non-discrimination provisions in the ILO conventions, for example? Because a lot of gender provisions are reaffirmations. So how can those be given more teeth? And how can the implementation of trade agreements and the institutions around trade agreements support these other treaties? And my last question is about this idea of dispute settlement, and that gender provisions should be subject to dispute settlement and maybe even to stronger enforcement mechanisms. So since many gender-related provisions are reaffirmation provisions or cooperation provisions, they are therefore relatively aspirational. My question is kind of, you lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, what does it mean to have provisions like that subject to dispute settlement? And if I can make just one more point specifically to Laura, who is within her research asking for some comments, my suggestion there would be look not only into trade in terms of feminist foreign policy, but another, super big element of foreign policy, which may also be a bridge, and that is foreign assistance. I know that in Spain, for example, they have a feminist foreign policy, and it really plays out more in terms of foreign assistance than in terms of actual trade and, foreign trade policy, particularly because foreign trade policy in Europe is under the European Commission and not under the countries. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your questions, Jane. Anyone else from the audience who had a question online? Are there questions or comments? I don't see a hands up, so perhaps Petra and then Laura, she wants to maybe react. So I have two questions. Three questions. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. And online there's another question from Marlene. And yes, okay, so let's proceed.
Okay, thank you. 3 quick points. 2 are related to what Jane just asked on this feeling that one of the problems of the trade of the gender chapter is that they are not under dispute settlement. But if you look at the language, you really ask yourself which kind of dispute is there on this. So I think it's a kind of, again, a non-issue. The languages are such that you cannot have realistically a dispute about it. The second point is, again, that Jane very rightly brought up is on the ex-ante gender impact assessment. That would be extremely useful instruments to see what likely would happen to women and to other sectors of the population once the agreement enters into force. And the EU has a very, does impact assessment thoroughly before when the agreements are under negotiation. But then we see some very strange results that the negotiations are concluded, and after that the impact assessment results come. And then the negotiators say, no, we are sorry, we haven't negotiated, it's over. So all this work of the impact assessment gets lost because there is no coordination between those who carry out the impact assessment and the negotiators. So an instrument that in principle would be extremely useful get lost. And the third and the last point is that countries start doing these trade and gender chapters, and usually they feel very proud of it. So wouldn't it be more effective to have gender considerations all to an agreement than having this Cinderella gender chapter that is isolated from, in most cases, isolated from the other chapters, and is there for full of good intentions with very little implications. So, from yesterday from Marcella, we heard that the Chile-Uruguay agreement had some good outcomes for women exporters. Thank you.
Thank you, Simonetta. Shall we take a few more questions, or maybe?
Mine is more of a comment.
There is a comment, so let's take a question. Is there a comment?
I have a comment.
Also, 2 comments. Okay, 2 comments.
There are 2 hands raised.
And there are 2 hands raised online. Let's do it with the audience, and then we'll go back to online.
Okay. It's on, is it? Okay. So I was just going to comment on the copy and paste thing, and obviously that is something that we see a lot happening, and it's happening with the gender chapters too. But I just wanted to reflect on one of my personal experiences when so in 2017, when the Canada-Chile chapter was negotiated, out of the blue, the government just got in touch with me and said, well, we are doing this and we need you to comment on this thing like yesterday. And they gave me a template of, what to sort of refer to in terms of the direction. And that was the Chile-Uruguay text. And I didn't even really know what exactly we were doing at the time. I just did the best work that I could. The point I'm trying to make is that it was a Chile-Uruguay text that was the template for the Canada-Chile agreement. And then that agreement was sort of copied for the Canada-Israel agreement. So, if you trace it back, then it's that there is an issue between the developing and developed. I see your argument, but it's more complicated, I think, than that, because it sort of, migrates from both directions, I think. I just wanted to comment on, I wanted to say that I agree with Jane about the feminist resistance policies, because we definitely have the we definitely maybe another time.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to online. Okay, sorry. We first have one comment here in the room, and then we go online to Marianne.
Well, I thank you for this interesting presentation. I think these presentations about the gender chapters really indicate the way we need to go, because we really progress step by step. I mean, the first studies about the link of trade and gender were made in the 90s. And it took 20 years to convey this issue to the trade policy makers. So, which was not easy by all means. And then, we got the WTO declaration in 2017, gender chapter between Chile and Uruguay, and then Chile, Canada. And however, I think we somehow expect too much from these chapters. I think they are stepping stones towards bringing gender provisions into also the trade and investment chapters. And now, keep in mind that they first position gender issues in trade policy. And now their focus is cooperation and on different issues, including data, capacity building, women traders. And the point has been made that they are not binding. Well, I think strictly in legal terms, all commitments in an agreement, which is really a contract, are binding. Already the Vienna Convention said, the Pacta sunt servanda, and that they don't have trade sanctions is another point. And but on the other hand, if we are dealing mainly with cooperation issues, would it make sense to have a trade sanction raising tariffs for tires or batteries or canned peaches? I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. I think that the European Union-Chile agreement really is a considerable progress. Also regarding dispute settlement, it has, I invite you to look at it. And regarding the copy template and the copycat issue and imitation issue, well, as Jane said, I just invite you to look at other chapters, at the competition policy chapter or the sanitary and phytosanitary chapters. They're not so very different.
But they're global standards.
Yes. And as a result, I think it was very...
Sorry to interrupt you, but
Yes.
We are running short of time, and there are four more hands up, so if you can.
Yes,
Sorry
I
to interrupt.
What I think our challenge is today is to mainstream gender provisions into the trade and investment chapters and services and market access is very important also. And there are three areas we can address in the different chapters, which is non-discrimination and prohibition of discrimination between women and men, affirmative action provisions, and preservations and exceptions. And I would like to invite everybody, if they have good ideas on these issues, to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The discussion is getting more and more interesting. So I think we can pursue many of these points. We have only about 10 minutes left. Is that correct? So let's go quickly to the hands online. Let's start with Marjolein, then Anna, and then Spriyansh. Just quick questions, please, or reactions as you like.
It's actually Patricia who's going to ask a question.
Yes, if I may, Martin, thank you. Very straight to the point. There is a crucial issue and kind of a constraint we are experiencing now in our ongoing research, and that relates to indicators, a set of indicators to measure and assess progress towards promised gender provisions, either in the gender chapters or in one of the components of the advanced free trade agreement of Chile and the European Union as a case in point. So our question is, who is working on building these indicators that can bring us close to some policy coordination between the promises made in different areas like feminist foreign policy, trade provision, human rights? We have a framework, we have CEDAW that gives us a space, policy space to be creative, innovative, and to embrace this overarching dimension of diversity that we have been discussing. The question is, who's there working on it? And is there any way we can work together on building those indicators, micro and macro level? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question, very clear. Anna, please.
Hi, I just have a question for Laura. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I was wondering if in your research you have reflected on seen any evidence about the ideological framework or kind of like the ideological perspectives that different governments may have when they are or are not pursuing gender objectives. So have you actually seen any divergence between, for example, left-leaning or right-leaning governments in terms of how they approach foreign policy in this particular subject? I hope that we will have a chance to respond to some of the comments, particularly Jane's later. Are we doing another round?
Are we answering?
I don't think we have time for
Okay, can I just very briefly respond to the question by Jane earlier on supporting the implementation of gender treaties through trade? Just a quick note to say that essentially my argument might be seen as a way of enforcing, in a way, gender provisions, in the sense that if you are allowed actually to take measures that would prioritize or would actually give any kind of preferential treatment to products that are produced by women or by ethical ways without exploitative labor, etc., this could be seen as a form of sanction that would effectively assist in the monitoring and implementation. I wish we had more time to elaborate on this. This is kind of like a brief comment. Thank you very much for the question and for the engaging discussion.
Thank you very much. I think we should have an email follow-up after this. Surian, please, very quick.
We have a very quick question. So we had a very great presentation and very good informative session. But all the suggestions that were made here, and this question is to panel, these suggestions, how do you see that these suggestions can be actually effectuated in political will, and how can we see that these FTAs really represent what we are actually discussing here? Amrita ma'am also discussed how we can see the provisions are copy pasted in some sort, and without some novelty, although some exceptions are there, as she mentioned Chile, but we are not seeing any change in direction or the sort of thing that we are discussing here. So how do you see that this can be actually effectuated in political will of the countries? That is the question.
Thank you very much. Good question. That's not an easy answer, that's for sure. Anyway, I don't need to answer. I can easily give the floor to my panelists. I know Laura, she had asked for the floor earlier. I don't know if it was to answer questions or to raise a question.
I had a question for Amrita, but maybe we can talk later. Can I just say,
yes,
well, one quick question related to political will and Anna's question. Yes, clear ideological differences, so at least around feminist foreign policies, that they're all left-leaning states, like all of them. And when they stop being left-leaning states, then they might drop the feminist foreign policy. Even within Canada, we have a shift within our own Liberal Party, which may be leading to dropping that. I wanted to say about the post facto ex ante evaluation. This was a big critique we made earlier of Canada's approach. It was only post facto evaluation, and they did move under pressure to do ex ante evaluation. But our critique related to some of our discussion is that it only looks at the impact on Canadian women, and I would say read as white, workers or so forth. It's only about market access. And so you can't raise any critique of what is the impact on Chilean women of increased resource extraction through our FTA, because that's not relevant for the way they evaluate it. It's all about the domestic impact, which is how trade negotiators work. But if you brought in this broader gender perspective, human rights perspective, then perhaps we could push them towards looking at both parties to the agreement.
Okay, thank you very much. Amrita, you want to give a final comment?
Sure.
Yeah, you want to.
Sure. I really quickly want to touch upon a few questions, really important questions. Ex ante assessment, very good idea, very important, but too costly, especially for developing countries. Dispute settlement and enforcement and making the gender provisions binding, too risky. Because the language of gender provisions is very vague. So if you look at the vagueness, and if you make those vague provisions enforceable, especially developing countries are running the risk of reducing their comparative advantage at the hands of developed countries. Cross-cutting provisions throughout the chapters, excellent idea and the next step in the field, definitely. Taking them out of preambles and cooperation and standalone. But very difficult at the moment because there's very less research and understanding on the field. So how we can intermingle with the ideas of market access, TBT, SDS in light of women concerns that they are facing pertaining to those areas, pertaining to those barriers or market access issues. And finally, to Alicia's question on, we have the same language, we have a copy and paste and excessive use of boilerplate approach in all the market access space, TBT, SDS, MFN, you name it, and it's all Article 20, they're all added word by word. I agree with you. But what is the aim of those chapters? The aim of those chapters is regulatory coherence, harmonization, adding global standards. But what's the aim of the chapters and provisions on gender? To address the barriers, challenges that women face. And they're very different. There's no way we can harmonize them. We'll defeat the purpose if we harmonize them.
Thank you very much. I think it's always good to conclude a panel discussion with lots of questions that remain to be addressed and to be considered. My question to the organizers is that next time perhaps make a session like this more gender balanced. I'm the only man in the panel. One male speaker. about 10 women. That's not really very generous, but with that comment, I think.
You've got enough years.
With that comment, we conclude, we survived, and I thank everybody for their excellent inputs and their interesting questions, observations, and answers to the question. Thanks to all the panel. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Good panel. It's very interesting to see in the discussions with the panel. I'm not too confident Canada's going to. Someone wants to say, your crowd do what they do.